Not far from the village of Bincombe on the outskirts of Weymouth, there lies a series of barrows that sit atop the South Dorset Ridgeway. Although earthworks such as these are not uncommon along the ancient trackway known as the Land of Bone and Stone, these particular mounds are unique in their arrangement and uniformity. Rather than a cobbled-together mass of memorials built on top of each other over the centuries, these are all of a similar size and circular shape. Perfect little round piles that dot the ridgeway in an uninterrupted line, straight as an arrow. As a result, they are known to locals simply as the Bincombe Bumps. Although historians and archaeologists have long studied them, and used every technical tool they possess to uncover their secrets, there's one secret that the Bumps have never revealed. You see, while the scientists and the young uns and the incomers will write this off as simple superstition, the older folk, of which there's still one or two left breathing, know that the Bumps have long marked the home of the Fairy Folk. Now, before we go any further, I want you to put any thought of the creatures you may have seen on film, or read about in children's books out of your mind. True fairy folk are neither sprightly nor friendly. Instead, they are twisted and avaricious, little more than impish beings fueled by cruelty and hateful of those they call the big folk. If you were to meet one, you wouldn't see anything that resembled a miniature human possessed of breathtaking beauty or butterfly wings. Instead, you'd be greeted by a warped collection of deviant features reminiscent of reptile and insect alike. What wings they do possess are gnarled and pockmarked, serving only to assist their leaping assaults rather than provide a true means of flight. While they do indeed have eyes that resemble ours, they exist as a compound collection of weeping sores set into a face covered with oily brown fur and graced with a mouth lined with fine venomous teeth. Furthermore, like many of the insects that share our world, they live in a structured society comprised of soldiers and drones, but none of them takes precedence over the queen that rules them all. While there's no such thing as a kindly fairy queen, the one that resides above Bincombe is especially wanton and savage. For centuries, the inhabitants of the village would always retreat back to Weymouth in order to give birth to their sons and daughters, lest the fairy folk seize them and replace them with changelings. Furthermore, they would always make sure to lock up their livestock in the churchyard and their grain in the tithe barn, just in case the fairy queen ever had a mind to poison them. The fairy's secret weapon, though, was always the fog. Even on the clearest days, those without so much as a cloud in the sky, the fairy folk could cause a choking fog to descend upon any traveller who happened to be passing along their section of the Ridgeway. In the midst of that choking, blinding fog, the unsuspecting travellers would suddenly find themselves assaulted from all directions, as the sound of misshapen wings beat in their ears and they felt the sting of needle-sharp teeth bite into their flesh before the tranquilizing toxin took effect. Once sufficiently sedated, the fairy folk would bind their victims with rope made from spider silk and bring them down into their kingdom through secret passageways known only to the tribe. Once there, the captives would be brought before the queen and subjected to a pantomime of hospitality. Although they would be presented with huge platters of fine-looking food, the first bite would reveal it to be rancid and cloying, full of vile acidic juices that burned the throat and stung the eyes. Nevertheless, they would be forced to finish every bite, and once the final morsel had been consumed, they would be instructed in their duty as guests. It was terrible manners, the fairy queen would tell them, to arrive in a monarch's hall and partake of a monarch's food without offering them a gift in exchange. It was at this moment that the full measure of terror would usually strike the captives. Once confronted with this expectation, they would offer everything and anything for the chance of escape. Money and jewels if they had them, services and the clothes off their back if they didn't, even their own bodies and their own virtue should they be comely enough to think that the offer may be accepted. Brothers would offer to slit each other's throats, fathers would betray their sons, and maidens would offer themselves up for all manner of depravity. Mothers would even sink so low as to offer up their own children if they thought it would give them the chance of reprieve. It mattered not, though, for the fairy queen only ever had one gift in mind. You see, the Ridgeway isn't just a chalk and earthen bank. It's not simply a geographical feature or an ancient trackway. It's always been something more. Eons ago, before the first of our species were born, before our Pliocene ancestors ever stood upright or terrible lizards ever walked the earth, the only creatures that existed were the fairy folk and the leviathans they worshipped. No two were exactly the same, but they were all gargantuan in scale and horrifying to behold. Some took the form of giant creatures plucked from nightmares before nightmares had a name. Others had no form until one was assigned to them by their followers, but all held dominion over their land and would brook no challenge to their supremacy. In those days, the fairy folk lived in sickening symbiosis with the leviathans they served. They would primp them and clean them and worship them without question, all in exchange for the putrid milk that would sustain them and a place in that hellish world. Soon enough, though, the world began to change, the air began to cool, and the continents began to form, and other forms of life began to take hold on what had been, up till then, a poisonous volcanic wasteland. Soon after, the leviathans started to fall into a great slumber. One by one they settled down to rest, and as they slept, the world we know today began to cover their bodies. As it did, mountains and hills began to form, encasing the sleeping giants in an earthen cocoon. Grief-stricken, the fairy folk continued to care for the sleeping giants while reserving nothing but bile and hatred for the creatures that had replaced them, especially the one species that had usurped their master's place at the top of the food chain. So the fairy folk continued their worship and dreamt of the day their masters would finally awake and hold dominion over all of us once more. As is always the way with gods and their followers, worship eventually turned to sacrifice, to gifts given in piety and prostration. And what gift is better than the still beating hearts of the species that usurped them? So, once their meal was done, the unwilling guests the fairy folk had seized would be bound once more. Their limbs would be shattered and their eyes removed to prevent any chance of escape. Once immobilized, they would be paraded in a parody of pompous ceremony towards an altar just below the barrows. To make the most of their gift and ensure it was well received, this ceremony would always take place when the sun was highest in the sky, and continued once the queen herself entered the chamber. There she stood upon her victim's chest with an ancient blade that was older than the land itself, and in one swift motion she would cleave open the rib cage, cracking bones and snapping tendons as she sliced through raw flesh and bathed in the arterial spurts that showered her. Reveling in the symphony of screams emitted by her victim, she would then seize the heart in one hand and sever the last of the blood vessels that held it in place. Holding it aloft, she would then emit a piercing cry of victory before taking her prize to the end of the chamber, where she would finally cast it down an ornate stone well that had been sunk into the leviathan's cocoon. Then, once the gift had been given, she would turn to her tribe and finally grant them leave to devour the corpse that remained, before adding its bones to the barrows. You see, that's what the Bincombe Bumps are in all truthfulness. Not so much burial mounds, but sacrificial midden heaps full of the remains of all those that dined with the fairy folk. Thankfully, there aren't too many people who go missing up there nowadays. Waymarkers and GPS mean it's not so easy to get lost, and mobile phones make it easier to reach help, even if no one believes you after it arrives. However, there are still some days where if you're close enough to the bumps and you listen carefully come midday, you might just hear the sound of screaming coming from within. There are those deluded enough by false tales and wishful thinking that will tell you these are the singing barrows, and that the sound coming from inside them is in fact delightful fairy music. But don't believe them. A fairy song it may be, but one constructed from tortured screams and cries for mercy. So, if you ever do find yourself up on the Ridgeway, and you see Bincombe in the distance, keep an eye out for the fog, and make sure your phone's well charged. For if the fairy folk think you're a likely target, you might just end up dining with their queen.